Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Shiur is Le'ilu Nishmat, Daniella, Shaina, Aleha Hashalom, Bas Yehoshua, Falik, Sheyichya, her neshama should have an aliyah, and Allah Yidin Ayashir. This is the first Shiur in a 6-week series of special Shiurim that we are doing in honor of Tishrei, in honor of the Yom Tovim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. The Shiur will run, please God, this series will run, please God, through the entire month of Tishrei. We'll have it, please God, every Thursday night, beginning at this time exactly at 7:30. Someone is telling me I need more light. I'm in the dark. Huh. No pun intended. Maybe that's a little better. I hope so. The Shiur will run through the next 6 weeks, please God, every Thursday evening at 7:30. This Shiur is in place in lieu of the Shabbos afternoon Shiur that we had for about 6 years. Running every Shabbos evening right before Mincha. The Shiur was, Baruch Hashem, very well attended until, unfortunately, coronavirus forced us out of shul and disrupted our schedules. This is an attempt to regain and to retain, at least to some degree, as much as possible, that Shiur. Again, Le'ilu Nishmat, Daniella, Shaina, Aleha Hashalom, Bas Yehoshua, Falik, Sheyichya. Okay. The Haftarah that we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, is a very famous Haftarah in which we read about the birth of Shmuel Hanavi. It's known as Haftarah's Chana, the Haftarah of Chana, because it deals primarily with the story around the birth of Shmuel Hanavi. The story, of course, we're all familiar with. Shmuel Hanavi's father's name was Elkanah. His mother's name was Chana. The Torah tells us that Elkanah, his father, had 2 wives. One was called Chana, one was called Penina. Penina had children, Chana did not have children. And Penina, Chana's sister wife, would torture Chana. She would provoke Chana over this on a regular basis. She would tease her about the fact that Chana had no children. And this caused Chana tremendous pain. The story in brief that we read in the Haftarah on Rosh Hashanah is that Chana reaches her breaking point, so to speak. And one particular Yom Tov, the Torah doesn't say which Yom Tov it was, but the rabbis tell us that it was Rosh Hashanah. She has had enough, and she goes into the Mishkan, and there she pours her heart out before Hashem in prayer for a child. The reason why I say she goes into the Mishkan, although of course the Jews are already in Eretz Yisrael at this stage, is because the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim had not been built yet. The Beis HaMikdash would be built later on by Shlomo HaMelech. The plans would be made by David HaMelech, but all this would follow many, many, many years later. At this stage, the Mishkan is still in a city. It's not even in Yerushalayim. It's in a city in Eretz Yisrael called Shiloh, and that's where the Jewish people go. That's where they're Oila Regel. That's where they go up on Yom Tov, and that's where Elkanah and his family would go on Rosh Hashanah as well. And it is over there in the Mishkan on Rosh Hashanah that Chana davens to Hashem and asks Hashem to be blessed with a child because until that point she is barren. As she's davening, again, you all know the story, as she's davening, she's spotted by the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol, the Torah says, was a man by the name of Eli, and Eli sees Chana davening, and Eli is convinced that she is intoxicated. Eli feels that she is drunk. All right, why Eli thinks that she's drunk is a bit of a separate discussion, but the bottom line is he thinks that she's drunk, and when she concludes her prayers, Eli verbally accosts Chana. Ad mosai tishtakorin, hasiri yenech me'aloich. What is going on here? Eli says to Chana, you're drunk, you're standing in the Mishkan. What kind of behavior is this for any Jew, for a woman on the holiest day of the year? And he really gives her a Misha Beirach. And when she's done, Chana says to him, no, I'm sorry, my dear Kohen Gadol, you have got it all wrong. I am not a woman who is drunk. I am a woman who has a broken heart. And I'm davening to Hashem that I be blessed with a child. Eli at that point realizes his mistake. He apologizes and he blesses Chana with a child as she has davened for. Chana, in her prayers, when she davened to Hashem for a child, says to Hashem, if you bless me with a child, I will give him, the child that is, back to you, Hashem, so that he can serve you his whole life. Eli blesses Chana that her prayers be fulfilled, and Chana has a son, and she names him Shmuel. She keeps her word. Chana keeps her word. At the very young age, Chana brings Shmuel back to the Mishkan, back to Eli the Kohen Gadol, back to Shiloh. She presents Shmuel to the Kohen Gadol and says, here you go. Here is the child that I davened for. Here is the child that you blessed me with. And she leaves him there in the Mishkan in Shiloh. The end of the Haftorah covers the song of prayer that Chana offers to Hashem in thanks for giving her that for which she davened, and that is the Haftorah that we read on Rosh Hashanah. The end of the story is that, of course, Shmuel remains in the Mishkan. He becomes Eli's student. He becomes Eli's protege. And eventually Shmuel becomes Shmuel Hanavi, the leader of the Jewish people. Shmuel Hanavi is the one eventually who anoints Shaul HaMelech as king over the Jewish people. And actually it was Shmuel himself who also informed Shaul HaMelech that kingdom, that royalty had been stripped away from Shaul and his family, and it would in turn be given to David and his descendants. Shmuel himself is also the one who anoints David HaMelech later on as king. Shmuel becomes the icon Navi who sets the Jewish people on this path that gives them kings, Shaul and eventually David HaMelech, who eventually gives us Shlomo HaMelech, who builds for us the Beis HaMikdash, from whom eventually comes Mashiach himself. Why we read this Haftorah on Rosh Hashanah? According to most interpretations, according to most commentaries, either because the story itself, Chana's prayer itself, happens on Rosh Hashanah, or because, according to others, Shmuel himself is actually born on Rosh Hashanah. Either way, it's connected to the Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah, and it shows us the power of prayer, of tefillah, which of course is what Rosh Hashanah is all about. Here she davened to Hashem, she was blessed by the Kohen Gadol, and she received that which she davened for. All right. Now, just for today, I want to focus with you on Pasuk Gimel. So I'm not sure if you have a Siddur or a Machzor in front of you, or if you have, for that matter, a Tanakh in front of you. The story of Chana, the Haftorah, comes from the beginning of Sefer Shmuel Aleph. So the Pasuk, the Haftorah begins, Vayihi ish echad min Ramasayim Tzoifim mehar Ephraim. There was a man who came from a place called Ramasayim Tzoifim, Ushmo Elkanah, his name was Elkanah. The Torah gives us his lineage. He was the son of Yerocham, etc. V'lo ishtei noshim, and he had two wives, of course, because which good story doesn't begin with a man who has two wives? Shem Achas Chana, the name of one wife is Chana. The Shem Hashem is Penina, the name of the second wife is Penina. Vayehi lePenina Yelodim, Penina has children. Ulachana ein Yelodim, and Chana doesn't have children. Here is Pasuk Gimel, the Pasuk I want to focus on today. Quote, Ve'olo ha'ish hahu me'iroi, this man, Elkanah that is, the one we're talking about, would go up, would ascend, me'iroi from his city, miyomim yomima, on a yearly basis, lihishtachav, to bow down, v'lizboyach, and to offer sacrifices, lahashem tzvokos, to the Lord of hosts, to Hashem, b'Shiloh, in the city of Shiloh, where the Mishkan was at that time. V'sham, and over there in Shiloh were Shnei Bnei Eli, two sons of Eli, Chofni uPinchas, Kohanim laHashem. End of Pasuk. So the Pasuk says that man Eli would go up to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Mishkan, on a yearly basis, lishtachavos, to bow down, to offer up sacrifices to Hashem. In Shiloh, the city where the Mishkan was at that time, and there in Shiloh were the two sons of Eli, Chofni uPinchas, Kohanim laHashem, Hashem's Kohanim. The commentaries struggle with two things, with two issues in this pasuk. Number one, what do we mean when we say that this man, V'olo ha'ishahu, that this man would go up from his city on a yearly basis to bow down and to offer sacrifices to Hashem. What's the problem? The problem is that there is a mitzvah. The problem is that the Torah is presenting this like some kind of special quality that this man had. You know what was special about him? You know who Elkanah was? He was the man who would go up on a yearly basis to the Mishkan in Shiloh. And all the commentaries say, really, what's so special about that? There's a mitzvah in the Torah called Aliyah L'Regel, which consists of no more and no less than the obligation on every Jew, no matter where they lived in Eretz Yisrael, to go up to the Beis HaMikdash, or in this case to the Mishkan, and to be there, and not just once a year, 3 times a year, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. So this was something that every Jew was obligated to do. And again, and not just on a yearly basis, but 3 times on a yearly basis. So what's this shvach? What's this praise that we're going on here? You know who this man, in other words, we're about to introduce him as the father of one of the greatest prophets the Jewish people ever had. Shmuel HaNavi, the Gemara will say, we'll get into this later or next week if we have time. The Shmuel HaNavi, the Gemara will say, is equivalent to Moshe and Aaron combined. And here the Torah is telling us the story of his conception, of his birth. All right, the Torah spares no detail on telling us how great his mother was. His mother davened, and his mother beseeched Hashem, and got a bracha from the Kohen Gadol, etc. But it also tells us some words about his father. You know what the yichus of his father was? That he would go to the Mishkan once a year. Imagine, you want to say, you know, such a Pliny ben Pliny, such and such a yid is a tzaddik. You know what a tzaddik he is? He puts on tefillin twice a week. Puts on tefillin. First of all, he's supposed to put it on every day. And second of all, not just him, everybody's supposed to put on tefillin every day. So the first question the commentaries ask here is, what is this shvach? What is this? Why is the Torah displaying this as this is supposed to be some indication of the man's greatness, that he was Oile Regel once a year. If he was Oile Regel, he should have done it 3 times a year, not once a year. And if he was Oile Regel, and if this is Oile Regel, it wasn't just him, it should have been everybody. Together with that, let's throw in another obvious question, part of this conversation. According to those who say that this story happened on Rosh Hashanah, if the story happened on Rosh Hashanah, then Rosh Hashanah is not one of the 3 regalim. There's no Bechlal mitzvah to go up to the Beis HaMikdash, to go to the Mishkan on Rosh Hashanah. So then it seems like we're not only not talking about a mitzvah that he's doing, but it seems silly. In other words, imagine you say, the guy is so holy, he eats matzah on Tu B'Shvat. I mean, the mitzvah to eat matzah is on Pesach. Is on Pesach. The mitzvah to be Oile Regel is Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. So if the story is taking place on Rosh Hashanah, then why are we so excited about saying, oh, you know what? He was Oile Regel on Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, there's no mitzvah to be Oile Regel. Either you go to Uman, or you stay home and you spend time with your family. Just kidding. So the first question the commentaries ask is, what's this business that the Torah is praising the Torah is praising Elkanah as the man, the father of Shmuel, the man who would go to the Mishkan once a year. That's question number 1. And question number 2, the end of the pasuk seems to have no connection to the beginning of the pasuk. The pasuk concludes, V'sham, and over there in Shiloh were Shnei Bnei Eli, the 2 sons of Eli, Chofni uPinchas Kohanim laHashem. First of all, why do I need to know at this stage of the story what were the names of the Kohanim? Secondly, how is it relevant to the pasuk? And thirdly, it's a very weird thing the Torah says. Think about it. The Torah has not yet even told us that Eli was the Kohen Gadol. We have not yet been introduced to Eli himself. And the Torah is already rushing in and saying, V'sham, and over there in Shiloh, in the place of the Mishkan, were the 2 sons of Eli, Chofni uPinchas, Kohanim laHashem. Why are we talking about the sons of Eli before we talk about Eli? And why is it relevant at this stage to tell us that Chofni uPinchas were the 2 sons of Eli? When seemingly all the pasuk is saying is that Elkanah took his family to the Beis HaMikdash, to the Mishkan, where there they would offer karbonis, and over there the story continues from there about how Chana davened to Hashem for a child. Okay, so the commentaries give the following explanation. There is, in order to understand this, we have to give a brief introduction. The Torah, at this point, the Torah just tells us that the two sons of Eli, Chofni and Pinchas, were Koyanim LaHashem, were Hashem's Koyanim. But it doesn't tell us anything more about these two characters, Chofni and Pinchas. At this point, the Torah doesn't tell us anything about Chofni and Pinchas, just that they were Eli's sons and they were Koyanim LaHashem. But a little later on, in Perek Beis of Shmuel Aleph, the Torah spares no detail in describing the character and the nature of these two Koyanim LaHashem, Chofni and Pinchas. Turns out they were a walking Chilul Hashem. They were a walking disgrace. They were supposed to be the Kohanim. They were supposed to be the ones who represented the Jewish people to Hashem. They were supposed to be the ones to whom the Jewish people looked up to as the spiritual leaders. And yet the Torah makes it clear that they were really no good mix. The Torah calls them B'nai Belial. B'nai Belial, it's a biblical term referring to lawless individuals that do not follow the will of Hashem. They were guilty of no less than the three cardinal sins. Number one, they were guilty of immorality. Number two, they were guilty of incestual relationships. And number three, they were guilty of murder. Turns out these guys, Chofni and Pinchas, were terrible, terrible human beings. The Torah says, later on, the Torah says that they would steal the meat that the Jewish people would offer up as sacrifices to Hashem. The Kohanim would steal them. They would intentionally abuse women who would come to the Beis HaMikdash with the desire to offer up korbanos to Hashem as part of their purification process so that they could go home and resume their regular lives as married women. The Kohanim, Chofni and Pinchas would abuse these women. They were guilty of idolatry, which is why the Gemara says is the deeper reason why the Torah uses the word Belial, which in the Chumash is used in the context of idolatry. They were, in those days, the icon of spiritual leaders gone wrong. Corrupt, bribed, evil, abusive, non-believing, non-worshipping, corrupt human beings. Their father, Eli the Kohen Gadol himself, for whatever reason, does not rebuke them, does not chastise them sufficiently, does not, for whatever reason, doesn't really call them to task. And for this, their father himself, Eli, is also held in part responsible. And the children, Chofni and Pinchas, bring disgrace upon the family of Eli and upon the Beis HaMikdash. It gets so bad, the process spirals to such a degree that in the end of Perek Beis of Shmuel Aleph, that is the end of the second chapter, Eli is approached by an Ish Elokim. Eli the Kohen Gadol, is approached by a man of God. The commentaries say this man of God was actually Elkanah. Was actually Elkanah himself, the father of Shmuel. He's approached by a man of God who tells him that Eli's entire family was going to be cursed because of the tremendous Chilul Hashem brought about by Chofni and Pinchas. You see, my friends, it's like this. The Kohen Gadol system was supposed to work the same way Melucha, the same way monarchy and rulers work, even in the Jewish people, where it goes from father to son, down the generations. But because of the corruption of Eli's sons, Chofni and Pinchas, and because Eli himself doesn't rebuke them adequately, Eli himself gets cursed and the Kohen Gadol is stripped from his family. Eli is told that none of his descendants will merit to have long life. Eli is told that he has brought about a Chilul Hashem and that he is responsible, at least in part, for it. And Eli is given a siman. Eli is told, the siman, the sign that your family is cursed, and no one in Eli's family or any of his descendants would ever merit to have arichas yomim. The sign for that, the siman, was that Chofni and Pinchas would die on the same day. Chofni and Pinchas brought a tremendous chilul Hashem upon the Jewish people. And the commentaries add this. You may remember, because we discussed this at great length in the Shabbos afternoon Shiurim, when we learned the stories of Shaul HaMelech and David HaMelech, you may remember that there's a story in which Shaul is chasing David. Toward the end of Shaul's life, Shaul pursues David to kill him. A long story with many details. And among the many stations that David goes through in a desperate attempt to save his life, David goes through a city called Noiv. You may remember this. Noiv was a city filled with Kohanim. And David HaMelech comes to them and he begs them for food and he begs them for shelter. David is starving to death at the time that he arrives in this city of Noiv, Ir HaKohanim. And the people, the members of the city, the Kohanim, they have pity on David. They don't know that he's running from Shaul, the king of Israel, who wants to kill him. They don't know the background story. They just see a young man struggling for his life in fear and in desperation. And they help him. They provide him with food. They provide him, if I remember correctly, even with some ammunition. And they provide food and shelter for many of David's men. And at that stage, at least, they save David's life. The story, that particular story, has a very, very tragic ending. Because one of Shaul's advisors by the name of Doeg becomes aware that Noiv, the city of Kohanim, has provided assistance and support to David HaMelech. And so he goes back to Shaul HaMelech, the king, and tells Shaul, Noiv, the city of Kohanim, are assisting David in his rebellion against you, Shaul. Don't forget, it was Shaul's advisors who were perpetuating the lie that David is trying to stage a rebellion against Shaul. And so in an effort as part of the conspiracy, they tell Shaul that Noiv, that the Kohanim in the city of Noiv are assisting David and thereby participating in the rebellion against Shaul. Shaul employs Doeg and his own army to go into the city of Noiv, Ir HaKohanim, and massacre all the people who live there. And they do. It's a brutal and bloody parsha in the story of our people's history. One for which even David HaMelech, the Gemara says, even David HaMelech later needed a tikkun. Of course, Shaul HaMelech loses the Malucha, he loses his monarchy in part because of this. But even the Gemara says in Masechta Sanhedrin, even David HaMelech needed a tikkun because Hashem came to him one day and said, you were at least indirectly in part responsible for what happened to Noiv, the city of Kohanim. David also needed a tikkun for this. Terrible, terrible story. The Gemara says in Masechta Sanhedrin, Doeg ha'adoimi, the one who carried out the massacre, the one under whose leadership this massacre was carried out, has no chelek in olam haba because of what he did. Terrible story. Noiv, called the city of Noiv, Ir HaKohanim. The commentaries say, Noiv, the city of Kohanim, they were all descendants of Chofni and Pinchas. It was so to speak, it was part of that curse that Eli had received, that their great-great-grandfather Eli had received all the way back in the days of Mishkan Shiloh, where Eli was told by an Ish Elokim, by Elkanah himself, that because of the terrible, terrible behavior of his two sons, Chofni and Pinchas, because of that, his descendants will not have long life. And it was fulfilled in the city of Noiv, Ir HaKoyanim. Now, why am I talking about all of this? The purpose, of course, is not Chas V'Shalom to get us depressed. But the commentaries explain that this is the deeper meaning of the pasuk. V'sham shnei bnei Eli chafni u'pinchas koyanim la'Hashem. The Torah says, the Torah tells us, when we tell the stories of Jewish history, when we talk about the past, when we think about what was going on in the days of the second Beis HaMikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash, Mishkan Shiloh Eli the Kohen Gadol. When we close our eyes, we imagine a reality that is pure and holy. It feels like it was a time where everything was right. It feels like Jewish people were going up to the Mishkan 3 times a year and having a divine religious experience. They were connecting to Hashem. Probably when we read the story, we think their souls were on fire. Turns out that's not what happened. Every time the Jewish people would be Oile Regel. Every time they would go up to the Mishkan in Shiloh, they would encounter 2 scoundrels, 2 corrupt leaders, 2 Koyanim who were robbing and stealing and abusing and corrupting. The 2 people that were supposed to represent everything holy represented everything perverted and vile. And so, my dear friends, what do you think happened? What do you think happened when every time they went to the Beis HaMikdash, they encountered these 2 no-goodniks and their old father who refused to set them right? What do you think happened? They stopped going to the Beis HaMikdash. Pesach would come, Shavuos would come, Sukkot would come. All the Jewish people were obligated to go to the Beis HaMikdash, and they would look at each other and shake their heads, and they would say to one another, I'm not going. I'm not going to once again be disappointed by people who are supposed to be Kohanim LaHashem, and instead are abusive thieves. I'm not going to a Beis HaMikdash in which the people who serve are supposed to be altruistic, only to meet selfish, self-centered, materialistic people. I'm not going to the Mishkan to watch the Schilul Hashem. And so with time, they stopped going until nobody, or almost nobody, was being Oile Regel. Along came a Yid, and his name was Elkanah. And the Torah says, V'olo ha'ish hahu me'iroi miyomim yomima. That man Elkanah, went up to the Mishkan from his city every single year. You know why the Torah says that man went up from his city every year? Because no one else from his city went up every year. Everybody else said, Everybody else said no. You tell us, they said, when those people in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Mishkan have gotten their act together, you tell us when the corruption is gone, you tell us when those perverts have left, and then we'll go. Until then, not happening. We're staying right here. And the entire Jewish nation stayed home. There was one Jew who stood up and said, no, this is wrong. There was one Jew who stood up and said to his fellow Jews, I'm sorry, you're making a mistake. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Yes, it's true, said Elkanah. Those Koyanim are corrupt. Yes, it's true, their father should be giving them Musar and he isn't. Yes, it's true, said Elkanah, going to the Mishkan can be a terrible disappointment. It's a Chilul Hashem. All true. But guess what, said Elkanah? None of that makes it right for us as Jews to stay home. If Hashem gave us a mitzvah to go to the Mishkan, if Hashem gave us a mitzvah to be Oile Regel, then we have to be Oile Regel. And when no one else was doing it, Elkanah went door to door and begged and pleaded and taught and promoted and pushed alone. Banged on the door of everybody who would let him in, and even maybe those who wouldn't, and told them, I'm not here to tell you that what's going on in the Mishkan is correct. It isn't. I'm not here to tell you that the system isn't corrupt, because the system is corrupt. But I am here to tell you that that doesn't exonerate you and I from going up to the Mishkan. It's not sufficient, Elkanah said to his fellow Jews, to sit at home with folded arms and say, those people who are supposed to know better don't. They're making a chilul Hashem and I'm going to sit it out. We don't do that, said Eli. When there's a problem, we work to fix it. We don't make it worse. When we see an injustice, when we see something that needs to be done, we get up and we do our best. And when we see darkness, even if the darkness is in the house of Hashem, the solution is not to stay home disillusioned. The solution is not to stay home and say, "Oy Gewalt, it's so terrible out there. There's nothing I can do. Boo-hoo." The solution is to ask myself, number one, what is the mitzvah that Hashem has given me to do? And number two, what can I do to make it better? And so Elkanah alone, took himself and his family and went up to the Mishkan, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, until slowly, he gathered a following. And he alone turned the tide and got other Jews to be Oila Regel as well. But the Torah takes it a step further. Elkanah didn't just go up to the Mishkan on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. He also went up on Rosh Hashanah. Why? Why did he go up? There's no mitzvah to go to the Mishkan on Rosh Hashanah. It's true, there isn't. But Elkanah said, I'll put it for you perhaps in simple terms. Elkanah said, you know something? When there's an extra element of darkness, when there's an extra blockage, when there's more corruption out there, when there is a greater need, we have to double down and we have to work even harder. Elkanah said, I am going to go to the Mishkan not just 3 times a year, on every other Yom Tov. I'm going to go Rosh Hashanah too. And when people will say to me, where are you going? What are you doing? I'm going to take one more opportunity to talk to every person I can about the greatness of the Mishkan and the beauty of the mitzvah of going up to the Mishkan. You know, the Gemara says, Eli, when he went to the Mishkan, never took the same road twice. Every time he went, he traveled through a different city, through a different town, took a different, at least slightly a different route somewhere. Why? Because as he went, he hoped he would have the opportunity where one more Jew would ask him, excuse me, I keep saying Eli, Elkanah, when he would go up to the Beis HaMikdash, he would go up to the Mishkan, he would hope to have one more conversation with one more Yid who would say to him, Elkanah, where are you going? And Elkanah would find the opportunity to inspire one more Yid and say to them, I'm going to the Mishkan. And just as I'm going to the Mishkan, so should you. Elkanah alone turned the tide. This now becomes the deeper meaning of the pasuk. He went up every year, 3 times a year for Oila Regel. He went up additionally on Rosh Hashanah. He went alone. Why? Because he had to fight the tide of these two, of Chilul Hashem that was created by these 2 sons, Chofni and Pinchas, Kohanim LaHashem. Now listen to this. Hold on to your heads. Where did this guy where did this Yid Elkanah, where did he come from? And where did his name Elkanah come from? Who was he named after? It turns out Elkanah was a Levi. And Elkanah had a very illustrious grandfather. You know who his grandfather was? Koirach. Who was Elkanah named after? Actually, that's a pasuk in Chumash. The pasuk says, "Ubnei Korach," the sons of Korach, were Asir, the Elkanah of Avi Yosef. Korach had a son called Elkanah. Korach ends up swallowed in the ground. The Torah says, "Bnei Korach loy mesu." The sons of Korach survive. One of them is Elkanah. Elkanah has an Einakol and an Ur-Einakol. Eventually, one of them is named Elkanah after one of Korach's sons, and this was the father of Shmuel. Now let's go back to the story of Korach, Elkanah's great-great-grandfather. What did Korach say? What was Korach's argument? Korach came to Moshe and Aaron and said, "You people are corrupt. You're supposed to be the leaders, you're corrupt. It's nepotism, this guy's the king, his brother's the Kohen Gadol." He went around to the Jewish people and he told them, the system is corrupt. The leaders have disappointed us. They're supposed to be shining examples of altruistic people who do it Laman Hashem, and they're doing it for the sake of their own ego. And Korach was a charismatic character. Korach was wealthy. Korach had the gift of the gab. He won over the entire Jewish nation. Moshe and Aaron, of course, were innocent. But Korach managed to convince them that Moshe and Aaron were in it for themselves and turned the Jewish people's heart against Moshe and Aaron. You see, Korach's argument was exactly the opposite. Korach said, the leaders are corrupt, let's rebel. Korach said, the leaders are selfish. The leaders have let us down. Korach said, those who are supposed to represent us to Hashem are foul and perverted. Let's rebel. And Korach did lead a rebellion. Korach's rebellion, of course, ends in disaster because Korach falsely accused innocent people. But just a couple of generations later, the Torah says, Chofniu Pinchas Kohanim laHashem. The people who were Kohanim were in fact corrupt. And here the argument of Korach would have had so much more value. Here somebody could have stood up and said, these people are supposed to represent us to Hashem, and they're the biggest Baalei Aveira. The Jewish people would have been entitled to stage the greatest rebellion ever. And yet it was Korach's own grandson who does teshuvah, who is metaken the chet, who fixes it in Jewish history, and turns around to the Jewish people and tells them, you don't fight darkness with stones. You don't fight it with sticks. You don't fight corruption with more corruption. You don't fight evil with more evil. You don't combat a Chilul Hashem with more Chilul Hashem. You don't add fuel to the fire. If the Kohanim are corrupt, Elkanah cried, then it's up to us to do what's right anyways. And in that moment, Elkanah has the merit to father Shmuel Hanavi, about whom the Gemara says he was equivalent in greatness to Moshe and Aaron combined. The cycle had been completed. Elkanah taught a generation of Jews the right way to deal with corruption and darkness. He told them, you don't kowtow to it. You don't accept it. You don't perpetuate it. You don't sit there with your arms folded and go, all the leaders are corrupt. What do you want from me? You don't do that. None of those options. What do you do instead? Instead, you pick yourself up, and you go to the Mishkan. And you show a living example. And you walk there and you show, and you tell one Jew after the other who sees you going and asks you, where are you going? You tell them you're going to the Mishkan. And they say, the Mishkan, the place of corruption? And you say, no. The Mishkan, the house of Hashem, which unfortunately has been hijacked or is possessed by corrupt people. But the mitzvah upon us is to go up there and fix it. I once heard a beautiful, beautiful vort from an educator. The educator said, he said something amazing. He said, you know, the Torah tells us that we're obligated to prepare roads for the cities of refuge. So that when an individual, when a Yid Rahman al-Islam, kills someone by accident or even on purpose, and they have to run to the city of refuge, the roads should be well paved, because the Goyal Adam, the avenger of the blood, the relative of the victim, would be chasing the unintentional murderer. We don't want him to get stuck on the road. We don't want him to fablonja. So the roads had to be prepared and well paved. They had to be wide so that a person who was fleeing to the city of refuge could make it there no problem. More than that, the Gemara says, because the Torah instructs us, Tochin l'cho haderech, prepare the roads, there was a sign at every crossroads telling people which direction was the Ir Miklat. Which direction were the cities of refuge? So that when you got to an intersection, if you were running to the city of refuge, you didn't have to ask anybody. You would look up and there would be a sign to the Ori Miklat or to the right, and you could take off and continue running. I once heard a presentation by an educator who said this word, Sfasai Mishak. He said, how come there were no signs by any of the crossroads telling you which way is the Beis HaMikdash? This way to Yerushalayim. This way to the Mishkan, this way to Shiloh, this way to the Kohen Gadol, this way to the holiest place in Yerushalayim, this way to the holiest place in Eretz Yisrael. No. For every year Miklat, for every city of refuge where murderers would go, there were signs on the intersections telling you which way to go. But for Yerushalayim, for the Beis HaMikdash, no signs. Why? All right, on a simple level, it's not a question, because anybody else could stop and ask for directions. They were not in such a rush. But a person who had killed was chas v'sholom, was in a terrible rush. Somebody was hot on his trails chasing him. He had no time to stop and ask anybody. He needed a sign. Everybody else had time, but him not. That's the simple level. But this man who was an educator gave a beautiful interpretation. He said, there's no signs at the intersection telling you which way is Yerushalayim. There's no sign at the crossroads telling you which way to the Beis HaMikdash. Why not? Because if you're going to the Beis HaMikdash, we want you to stop at the intersection, turn to the person next to you and say, which way to Yerushalayim? Which way to the Beis HaMikdash? Which way to the holiest place on earth? We want you to stop at every intersection and talk to people about it. Why? Because we want you to inspire them to follow your example. We want people to look at you and go, you're going to Yerushalayim. I'm also going to go to Yerushalayim. You're going to the Beis HaMikdash. I'm also going to go to the Beis HaMikdash. We want this to become a conversation that goes on. We want this, as they say in today's day and age, we want this thing to go viral. Everybody should be talking about going to the Beis HaMikdash. No signs. Stop and ask for directions. Engage in conversation. Talk to another Yid. Maybe the other Yid is finding it difficult to go to the Beis HaMikdash. Maybe they're disillusioned. Maybe they're disappointed. Maybe they don't see the importance of it. Stop and ask them for directions. And when you do, please God, the Jew will look at you and go, you're going to the Beis HaMikdash? And then you have an opportunity with true inspiration to tell them, yes, I'm going. The first man who started this was Elkanah. Elkanah took a generation of disillusioned Jews, and not disillusioned for the wrong reasons. Disillusioned for very, very legitimate and valuable reasons. And Elkanah said to them, when we are disappointed, when something happens that sets us back, when there is darkness in the world, the Jewish response is not to cower away and say, "Oy Gewalt, those people are corrupt. What am I going to do? The Mishkan, the Beis HaMikdash is in the hands of evil people." Never. Pick yourself up. Fulfill the mitzvah that is upon you. Stand up for what's right. Tell the Jewish people, tell the Jewish nation, tell the Kohanim, tell the Rabbeinu Shalom, we refuse to accept this. With time, the light will always win. And because of that, the Torah tells us, Elkanah merited to have a son, Shmuel. Shmuel dealt with many, many obstacles from the Jewish people. Like every good Jewish leader. They challenged him at every step of the way. But he never forgot the lesson that was taught to him by his father Elkanah, who stood up for what's right and inspired an entire generation to follow his direction. I heard a man once pray to Hashem and said, Rabbeinu Shalom, there's so much tzoros in the world. There's so much pain. There's so many problems. Rabbeinu Shalom, why don't you do something about it? And the Rabbeinu Shalom responded to him and said, I did do something about it. I created you. Don't talk to me about how big the problems in the world are. I, Hashem, created the problems. I know exactly what's going on. But I put you in the world, and now I ask you, what are you going to do about it? Sit and kvetch? Sit and cry? Point fingers at everybody else and tell me how corrupt everybody else is? Maybe you're right. I ask you a simple question. Then what? What does that help? Elkanah understood that it wasn't about being right. It was about inspiring a generation of Jews, disillusioned Jews, to go back to the Mishkan, to go back to the house of Hashem. And yes, because of that, he merited to have a son, Shmuel. Why do I say this? My friends, it's not difficult to look around now and see the darkness in the world around us on every level. It's not difficult to be disillusioned and disappointed. It's not difficult to get frustrated with people who are supposed to be doing all sorts of things, and they are not. If you see the darkness in the world, you may be right. Or I shouldn't say you may be, you are right. But as Jews, we've been given the power by Hashem to father a Shmuel Hanavi, to inspire a generation, to turn around to Jews and say, stop kvetching and complaining, get out there and do something, inspire another Yid, go to the house of Hashem, whatever that means, physically or spiritually. Fill the world with light and beauty. If you can't fill the world, fill your corner, fill yourself, fill your own home. But never forget the power and the mission and the mandate that we have as Yidden. Shmuel Hanavi was taken to the Mishkan at the age of 2. He was but a child. And yet, even as a child, he contained within himself the soul of a Jewish leader, of one who wouldn't just sit back and take it, but one who would get up and inspire and lead others. May Hashem bless us all with a ksiva v'chasima tova, Lashana Tova Mesukah, a year filled with brachas and with nachas and simchas and gesund. And let's always remember, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. When a Jew looks around and sees, may Hashem protect us, anti-Semitism and darkness in the world. As Jews, we know because of the gifts, because of the power that Hashem has given us, we can, perhaps slowly, we can light up the world and inspire our fellow Jews. Have a wonderful evening, and for those whom I won't see before Shabbos, a wonderful Shabbos.